A current flowing through a wire will produce its own magnetic field. The motor effect is when such a wire is in another magnetic field and it will experience a force. The equation is F-bil, where F is force, I is current in amps, L is length of the wire in the magnetic field, and B is the magnetic flux density, essentially the magnetic field strength. This is measured in Tesla. Rearranging the equation for B also shows us that an alternative unit for flux density is newtons per amp per meter. Note that this equation only works as it is if the current and magnetic field lines are perpendicular to each other. So therefore, if the wire is parallel to the field lines, it will experience no force. To find out the direction of the force, however, on the wire, we use Fleming's left-hand rule. Your thumb is force, first finger is field, middle finger is current. Make a janky gun with them where they're all perpendicular and bam, freeze, FBI. Just twist your wrist to line up your fingers with the current and the field, always north to south pole. And the way your thumb is pointing is the direction of the force on the wire. In this case, upwards. To measure the size of the force in reality, we can put the magnet on a balance. Due to Newton's third law, the magnet will also be pushed down with the same force. Calculate the force from the fake mass measured. Use an ammeter to get the current and a ruler to measure the length of the wire. And what do you know? You can calculate the magnetic flux density between the poles of your magnet. If a free charged particle finds itself travelling perpendicular to a magnetic field, it will experience a force equal to BQV. For an electron or proton, we can say thus F-bev. We still use Fleming's left-hand rule, with the current finger now being used for velocity. However, as it's used for conventional current in circuits, which is technically the flow of positive charge, we must flip our hand if it's a negative charge like an electron. So our middle finger is pointing in the opposite direction to its velocity. If it's a proton or positive ion though, it's all good. Because we're thinking in 3 dimensions, you usually see the circular path drawn on the page. Then the field goes in or out of the page. That's represented by crosses or dots. As a circular motion, we can say that BQV equals mv squared over r, or m omega squared r, depending on whether you're dealing with actual speed or frequency in time period instead. Rearranging the first equation, we see that r is equal to mv over bq. So the radius of the circle is proportional to the mass and speed of the particle, and inversely proportional to the flux density and the particle's charge. With the angular version, we know that v equals omega r, so we see that the frequency of a particle moving in a circle is independent of its radius. A cyclotron is a machine that uses magnetic fields to produce a stream of high-energy particles like protons used for medical therapy purposes. We have a source of these particles sitting in the center of 2 hollow metal Ds, so-called because of their shape. A magnetic field is applied perpendicular to the Ds, which causes the protons to move in circles. But they're not much used if they stay in the center. So a PD is applied to the Ds, causing the protons to be attracted to and accelerated towards the negative D and away from the positive one. That increases their kinetic energy and speed and therefore radius too. Half a cycle later, they must be accelerated across the gap again in the other direction, so the PD must be reversed by the time they do this. In order for that to happen, we know that BQV or BEV equals m omega squared r. And replacing V with omega r and omega with 2 pi f, we find that r disappears and f equals BQ over 2 pi m. That means it doesn't matter how big the radius of the circle of a proton is, all the protons will have the same frequency and time period as they move in ever-increasing circles in the Ds. Eventually they spiral out, and that's how we get our beam. Whatever the frequency of the particle's circles is, that's also what the frequency must be of the alternating PD of the Ds, causing the particles to be accelerated. People will often incorrectly say that the frequency must somehow be twice that of the particle's frequency, as it needs to flip twice every time they do a circle. But flipping twice is exactly what a whole cycle is. Every cycle, the particles cross the gap twice. So that PD must be flipped twice too. We can determine what particles we have in a substance by putting them through a mass spectrometer. As BQV equals mv squared over r, we see that r equals mv over bq. If v, b and q are the same for all particles, then the radius of circular motion is proportional to mass of the particle. So that means particles traveling together initially will separate out according to their masses if they enter a magnetic field. B is the same if they're all in the same magnetic field. Q is the same if they're all singly ionized, that is, they've all lost 1 electron. Getting them all to travel with the same speed is more difficult, but it must be done in order for R and M to be proportional. To do this, we have a velocity selector before the main magnetic field. It's a device with a small hole in the end. We have a different magnetic field to the big one applied. So the particles experience a force in one direction, say upward, and an electric field applied in the other direction, say downward. Only particles for which these two forces are equal and balanced will carry on going straight through the hole. For them, EQ equals BQV. Electric force equals magnetic force. The Q's cancel and we find that V equals E over B. Those travelling too fast will be affected more by B and deflect and don't go through the hole. Too slow, on the other hand, and the opposite is true, and they'll deflect the other way instead. Those going just the right speed for our two fields make it through. Now we have a beam of particles that are all the same charge and travelling in the same direction with the same speed. There are two main designs then. Number one, the particles go through a semicircle in the magnetic field and hit a piece of film. The further along the film the spots are, the bigger the mass that caused them. We can measure this diameter to get the radius and then calculate the mass from that. Brighter spots means there's more of these particles hitting that spot, so it's semi-quantitative. The posher version, though, employs an array of detectors placed at different positions. Which one a particle hits depends on its mass. Of course, these can measure individual particles, so give accurate data on relative abundance of particles in a substance, for example. Flux is what we call the amount of magnetism that an area is exposed to. Symbol is phi, unit is Webers, but I also like to call them Wubs. Flux density is equal to flux over area. So another alternative unit for flux density, we already have Tesla and newtons per amps per meter, but it's also Webers per meter squared. It's how concentrated the flux is. Here's a loop of wire in a magnetic field. We can use the area of the loop with the known flux density of the field it's in to calculate the flux filling the loop. Phi equals B times A. Often it's a coil of wire that's capturing the flux, not just one loop. To calculate the total flux affecting the coil, we must take our flux and multiply it by the number of turns in the coil, N. This is then technically called flux linkage instead, but it works exactly the same as flux in calculations. We can also therefore represent flux linkage as BAN, B times A times N. If a loop of wire or a part of a loop experiences a changing magnetic field, an EMF is induced in it. Faraday's law is this: EMF induced is proportional to the rate of change of flux linkage. Now, in reality, the EMF is equal to minus the rate of change of flux, so volts are actually equal to Webers per second. But because we have that minus, we have to say proportional instead of equal to, but whatever. You have to know that definition. But to all intents and purposes, EMF, voltage, equals rate of change of flux. The classic example is a wire being moved through a field perpendicular to the field. Similar to F-Bill, if the wire was parallel to the field, this wouldn't work. The wire must cut the flux lines, as it were. We know that EMF equals delta phi over delta t, but I'm going to drop the deltas and minus here for convenience. We know that flux is equal to BA. This area is the area of flux swept through, we can say in time t. This area is equal to length of the wire times distance moved. So EMF is equal to BLD over t. Distance over time is speed, so it turns out in this case that EMF equals BLV. Nifty. So why is that minus there? Well, it's to show you that Lenz's law is also true. The direction of EMF induced is such that it will oppose the change that caused it. In other words, an induced EMF or current will try to stop itself being made. It does this by producing its own opposing magnetic field. After all, you know that's what a current flowing in a wire does. The opposing force is the reason why you can't just turn a generator freely. You have to put in work to overcome this Lenz's law. Fleming's right-hand rule tells us the direction of current induced. Same fingers, with the thumb being which way the wire is being pushed. Another example of Lenz's law is a magnet falling through a copper pipe. The pipe experiences a changing magnetic field and an eddy current is induced in it. That just means little circles of current. This produces a magnetic field of its own that opposes the motion of the magnet. That's why the magnet falls slowly through it at a constant speed. If a loop of wire enters a magnetic field, an EMF will be induced as it enters and leaves. While it's inside, the EMF is zero. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. One way is saying that the flux filling up the loop or coil is changing as it enters or leaves. But this stays constant while it's inside, even though it's moving. So therefore, no EMF while it's completely inside the field. The legit explanation, though, is that there is an EMF being induced on both sides of the coil in the same physical direction while it's inside, so they cancel each other out. When entering or leaving, there's only one constant EMF being induced on one side, and so therefore we have an overall resultant EMF. We can calculate this using BLV again. Even if you have stationary coils, you can still induce an EMF in one of them by applying AC to the other. The AC produces a constantly changing magnetic field which the other experiences. This wouldn't work with DC, as that would only make a static magnetic field. In this case, EMF is equal to A times delta B over delta T, because A isn't changing with B, but B is. In this case, you'll likely be given the maximum flux density, and you can just say that's equal to delta B because it will fall to 0 during the cycle, and then we just divide by the time it took to do that. This, of course, is also how transformers work as well. Generators use induction to produce an EMF. As the coil spins, the flux through it goes from a maximum when it's perpendicular to the field lines to 0 when it's parallel to the field lines. The rate of change of flux, however, is greatest when the flux is 0. The maximum flux is BAN, of course, or flux linkage anyway. So if you want the maximum rate of change of flux, we multiply by omega. The peak EMF induced in a generator is equal to BAN omega. The EMF the rest of the time then changes sinusoidally. So the EMF at any point is equal to BAN omega, that's the maximum EMF, times sine omega t or cos omega t, depending on whether it starts at 0 or a maximum, respectively. Don't forget that whenever you use sine or cos for spinny things, they have a pi in, so we have to use our calculator in radian mode. In a power station, instead of a coil spinning between magnets, they have an electromagnet spinning between 3 pairs of coils called stators. These produce 3 separate currents that go off to the national grid. That's why you have more than 2 wires running along pylons. Incidentally, overhead cables aren't made out of copper, as that would be too expensive and they'd be far too heavy. It's light and it's a pretty good conductor, but it's very, very ductile. So to strengthen it, we have a steel core running through the middle. Transformers are used in the national grid to change the voltage at which the electricity is transmitted through the overhead cables. Get this into your head right now though, there is, or should be, no electricity or current in the core. The alternating current in the primary coil produces its own magnetic field, and the iron core acts like a guide for it. We use iron, by the way, as it's easily magnetized and demagnetized. It works well as a guide. This magnetic field induces a voltage and current in the secondary coil. In order for a current to be induced, though, a wire must experience a change in the magnetic field, which again is why we must use AC. The ratio of turns in the coils is equal to the ratio of the voltages. If the secondary coil has double the turns, it has double the voltage and therefore half the current. A step-up transformer increases the voltage before it enters the grid. This then reduces the current, so less energy is lost due to heating. P equals I squared R. The reason I goes down when V goes up is because P is equal to VI, and if it's a perfect transformer, this will be the same across both. The magnetic field reason you have a different voltage induced in the secondary coil is because there are more or fewer turns in the coil to capture the flux that's in the core. In an ideal world, the power in and out of the transformer should be the same. That would mean that it's 100% efficient, so V and I are inversely proportional. However, in reality, they're never 100% efficient, and it's always the current that takes the hit. And so in this case, you stick the efficiency in front of V1I1, for example, 0.8 if it's 80% efficient. We know that Lenz's law explains why it's hard to rotate a coil in a generator. The induced current is fighting back with its own opposing magnetic force due to the motor effect. You can't have one without the other. But Lenz's law also applies to motors too. When a motor spins, the generator effect is also in play. When the motor is turned, an EMF is induced in a coil that opposes the EMF that's driving the motor to begin with. That might sound like a bad thing, but it's actually not. Say there's 6 volts supplied to a motor, but the opposing, what we call back EMF, is 2 volts in the opposite direction, which means that we now have overall 4 volts across the motor instead of 6, and therefore that reduces the power loss due to heating because the current has gone down, P equals I squared R. If a motor is under heavy load, it spins slowly. The back EMF is small and the current is high, so too heavy a load and the motor can burn out. I'm sure you've experienced this when you've smelt the smoke coming from your Scalextric car when you're holding it down but still pushing the throttle. If a motor is under light load, though, it spins faster, the back EMF is large and the current in the motor is small. Great. So I hope you found that helpful. Leave a like and a comment if you did, and don't forget to check out our revision app to help you test your knowledge, and I'll see you next time.